The wind howled like 1,000 demons across the frozen wilderness of northern Alaska. Snow fell so thick that Jake Morrison could barely see 3 feet ahead of his snowmobile. He had been a wildlife researcher for 15 years, but this blizzard was unlike anything he had experienced before. The temperature had dropped to -40 degrees, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Jake was making his way back to his remote research cabin when he first heard it. At first he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on his ears, but then it came again, a long, mournful howl that seemed to cut through the storm like a knife. He stopped his snowmobile and listened carefully. There it was again, closer this time, and filled with what sounded like desperation. As a wildlife expert, Jake knew the difference between various animal calls. This wasn't a territorial howl or a hunting call. This was something else entirely, something that made his blood run cold. It was a cry for help, raw and urgent, coming from somewhere in the swirling white chaos around him. He revved his engine and followed the sound, his headlight barely penetrating the wall of snow. The howling continued, growing more frantic with each call. Jake's hands were numb despite his thick gloves, and ice crystals had formed on his face mask. Every instinct told him to get to shelter, but something about that desperate cry wouldn't let him turn away. The landscape around him was completely transformed by the storm. Familiar landmarks had vanished under feet of snow, and the world had become an endless expanse of white. Trees bent under the weight of ice and snow, their branches creaking ominously in the wind. The cold was so intense that his breath froze instantly, creating a small cloud of ice crystals around his face. Suddenly, through the blinding snow, Jake saw a dark shape moving toward him. His heart stopped as he realized what it was, a massive gray wolf larger than any he had ever seen in the wild. The animal was struggling through the deep snow, its thick fur coated with ice. But what shocked Jake most was that the wolf wasn't running away from him. Instead, it was coming directly toward him. The wolf stopped about 20 feet away and let out another howling cry, its yellow eyes fixed directly on Jake. There was something in those eyes that Jake had never seen in a wild animal before. Intelligence, desperation, and what looked almost like pleading. The wolf took a few steps toward him, then stopped and looked back over its shoulder as if asking him to follow. Jake's training told him to be cautious. Wolves were dangerous predators, especially when desperate or protecting their territory. But everything about this animal's behavior suggested something different. The wolf wasn't showing any signs of aggression. Its ears weren't pinned back, its hackles weren't raised, and its tail wasn't positioned for attack. Instead, the animal seemed to be trying to communicate with him. The wolf moved closer, stopping just 10 feet away. It let out a softer whine, almost like a dog asking for help. Then it did something that made Jake's jaw drop. It actually bowed its head slightly, a gesture that seemed almost human in its meaning. The animal was asking for help, and somehow it knew that Jake might be able to provide it. Against every rule of wildlife safety he had ever learned, Jake turned off his snowmobile engine. The silence that followed was broken only by the howling wind and the wolf's heavy breathing. The animal's sides were heaving, and Jake could see that it was exhausted. Its paws were bleeding from fighting through the crusted snow, and there were patches where its fur had been torn away by ice. The wolf took another step forward and then did something that would haunt Jake for the rest of his life. It gently grabbed the sleeve of his parka with its teeth, not biting, just holding, and tugged gently in the direction it had come from. The message was clear. Follow me. Jake knew he should be terrified. He was alone in the wilderness with a massive predator during one of the worst blizzards in years. His radio wasn't working in the storm, and no one would be able to find him if something went wrong. But there was something in the wolf's behavior that overrode his fear. This animal was a mother, and she was desperate. He could see it now in the way she moved, the urgency in her actions, the protective instincts driving her through the storm. She had cubs somewhere out there in the blizzard, and they were in trouble. Somehow this wild animal had made the desperate decision to trust a human, to ask for help from the very species that most wolves feared and avoided. The wolf released his sleeve and took several steps away, looking back to make sure he was following. Jake made a decision that would change his life forever. He started his snowmobile and began to follow the wolf into the heart of the storm. The journey through the blizzard was like traveling through a frozen hell. The wolf moved with surprising speed despite the deep snow, occasionally stopping to make sure Jake was still behind her. She led him through areas where the terrain was completely hidden by snow, navigating by instincts that humans had long forgotten. As they traveled deeper into the wilderness, Jake began to worry about his own survival. His fuel was running low and the storm was getting worse. The temperature was dropping even further, and the wind was so strong that it threatened to knock him off his snowmobile. But the wolf's determination drove him forward. Whatever was waiting for them in the snow, it was important enough for this mother to risk everything, including trusting a human she had never seen before. The wolf led Jake through a maze of snow-covered rocks and fallen trees that would have been impossible to navigate without her guidance. The animal seemed to know exactly where she was going, even though everything looked the same to Jake's human eyes. The blizzard had erased all familiar landmarks, turning the landscape into an alien world of white. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, the wolf suddenly stopped. She stood perfectly still, her ears pricked forward, listening to something Jake couldn't hear over the howling wind. Then she let out a soft whine and began digging frantically in the snow at the base of a large pine tree. Jake approached slowly, his heart pounding with anticipation and dread. As he got closer, he could see that the wolf had led him to what looked like a natural shelter formed by several fallen trees and large rocks. The area was partially protected from the wind, but it was still buried under several feet of snow. The wolf's digging became more desperate, and Jake could hear something that made his blood freeze. The faint crying of wolf cubs, muffled by the snow, but unmistakably the sound of babies in distress. The mother wolf looked up at him with those intelligent yellow eyes. And in that moment, Jake understood everything. Her cubs were trapped under the snow, probably in a den that had collapsed or been buried by the blizzard. Without hesitation, Jake jumped off his snowmobile and began helping the wolf dig. The snow was packed hard by the wind, and his hands quickly became numb despite his gloves. But the sound of those crying cubs drove him to dig faster and harder than he had ever worked in his life. The wolf worked beside him, her powerful claws much more effective than his human hands at breaking through the crusted snow. She would occasionally pause to listen, then redirect their digging efforts toward where the sounds were strongest. Jake was amazed by her precision and intelligence. She knew exactly where her babies were, even under all that snow. As they dug deeper, Jake began to realize the true scope of the disaster. The cubs weren't just stuck in a den. They were trapped under what must have been a massive snowslide that had buried their entire home. The weight of the snow was enormous, and Jake started to worry that even if they found the cubs, it might already be too late. The mother wolf seemed to sense his concern, and she let out a series of soft barks toward the buried den. To Jake's amazement, he heard faint responses from below, weak but definitely alive. The cubs were still breathing, but they had been trapped for who knows how long without food, warmth, or fresh air. Jake's fingers were bleeding from clawing at the ice and rocks, but he didn't stop. The wolf mother's determination was contagious, and he found himself working with an urgency he had never felt before. This wasn't just about saving some animals. This was about a mother's love for her children, something that transcended species. As they dug, Jake noticed something that made his respect for the wolf grow even more. Every few minutes, she would stop digging and position herself between Jake and the area where they were working, scanning the surrounding area for threats. Even in her desperation to save her cubs, she was still protecting them, and him, from any other dangers that might be lurking in the storm. The wind continued to howl around them, and the snow kept falling. Jake's snowmobile was becoming buried, and he realized that he might not be able to get back to his cabin even if they successfully rescued the cubs. But none of that mattered now. He was completely committed to this rescue, bound to this wolf mother by something deeper than words or rational thought. After nearly an hour of digging, Jake's hand broke through into an air pocket. He heard a much clearer cry from one of the cubs, and the mother wolf went into overdrive, digging so fast that snow flew everywhere. Jake helped her clear away the remaining snow and ice, and finally, they broke through into the den. The sight that greeted them was both heartbreaking and miraculous. 3 tiny wolf cubs, no more than a few months old, were huddled together in the small space that remained of their den. They were alive, but barely. Their fur was matted with ice. They were shivering uncontrollably, and their eyes were wide with fear and confusion. The mother wolf immediately pushed past Jake and began licking her cubs, whimpering softly to reassure them. The sound she made was unlike anything Jake had ever heard from a wild animal. It was pure maternal love, relief, and joy all mixed together. The cubs responded to their mother's voice, trying to crawl toward her despite their weakness. But Jake quickly realized that their problems were far from over. The cubs were suffering from hypothermia and exhaustion. They had been trapped without food for at least a day, possibly longer. Even though they were free from the snow, they were still in the middle of a deadly blizzard with temperatures that could kill them within hours. The mother wolf seemed to understand this too. She looked at Jake with an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity, gratitude mixed with continued desperation. She had managed to save her cubs from the snow, but she couldn't save them from the storm. Jake looked around at the situation. His snowmobile was nearly buried. The storm was getting worse, and he was miles from any shelter with 3 dying wolf cubs and their exhausted mother. Every logical part of his brain told him that the situation was hopeless, that he should try to get himself to safety while he still could. But as he watched the mother wolf gently nudging her cubs, trying to get them to stand and move, he knew he couldn't abandon them. This family had survived the initial disaster, and somehow they were going to survive the rest of it too. He just had to figure out how. Jake quickly assessed the situation with the methodical thinking that had kept him alive during 15 years in the wilderness. The cubs were weak and cold, but they were breathing and responsive to their mother's touch. The mother wolf was exhausted but still alert and protective. The storm was worsening, and his snowmobile was running dangerously, low on fuel. He remembered the emergency shelter kit he always carried in his sled attachment, a small but well-equipped survival pack that included a lightweight emergency tent, thermal blankets, and chemical heat packs. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to keep them all alive until the storm passed. The mother wolf watched him carefully as he moved toward his snowmobile and began unpacking his emergency supplies. She didn't show any fear or aggression, but Jake could see the tension in her body. She was ready to defend her cubs if necessary, even though she had asked for his help. Jake moved slowly and spoke softly as he worked, the same way he would approach any wild animal. "It's okay, Mama," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We're going to get through this together." The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and she seemed to relax slightly. Setting up the emergency tent in the blizzard was like trying to build a house in a hurricane. The wind kept tearing the fabric from his numb fingers, and the snow made it nearly impossible to see what he was doing. But the mother wolf seemed to understand what he was trying to accomplish, and she helped by using her body to block some of the wind while he worked. Finally, Jake managed to get the small shelter erected against the natural windbreak of the fallen trees. It wasn't much, barely big enough for 2 people to lie down, but it would provide crucial protection from the worst of the storm. He quickly spread out the thermal blankets inside and activated several chemical heat packs. The real challenge now was getting the wolf family into the shelter. Jake had no idea how the mother wolf would react to being enclosed in a small space with a human. In the wild, wolves avoided confined areas where they might be trapped, and being in close quarters with a potential threat went against every survival instinct they possessed. But once again, the mother wolf surprised him. When Jake opened the tent flap and gestured toward the warm interior, she immediately understood. She gently picked up the smallest and weakest of her cubs by the scruff of its neck and carried it into the shelter. Then she went back for the second cub and finally the third. Jake watched in amazement as the mother wolf arranged her cubs on the warm blankets, then looked up at him expectantly. It was clear that she wanted him to join them in the shelter, not just because there was no other option, but because she trusted him. This wild predator, this creature that should have seen him as a threat, was inviting him to share her den. Carefully, Jake crawled into the small shelter and zipped the flap closed behind him. The change was immediate and dramatic. The howling wind became muffled, the temperature rose noticeably, and for the first time in hours they were all protected from the driving snow. The shelter was cramped with all 5 of them inside, but the warmth from the chemical heat packs and their combined body heat began to work its magic. The cubs, who had been shivering uncontrollably, gradually stopped trembling and began to look more alert. The mother wolf lay down with her cubs pressed against her warm fur, but she kept her eyes on Jake, still watching for any sign of threat. Jake positioned himself at the far end of the shelter, giving the wolf family as much space as possible, while still benefiting from the shared warmth. He could hardly believe what was happening. He was sharing an emergency shelter with a wild wolf pack during one of the worst blizzards in years, and instead of feeling terrified, he felt a strange sense of peace. As the hours passed, the cubs grew stronger and more active. They began to nurse from their mother, a sight that filled Jake with hope and wonder. The smallest cub, a little female with distinctive white markings on her chest, seemed to recover the fastest. She was soon crawling around the shelter, exploring this strange new environment with typical puppy curiosity. The mother wolf gradually relaxed as she saw her cubs recovering. She stopped watching Jake with the intense focus of a guard and began to rest herself, though she never let her guard down completely. Occasionally, she would look at Jake with what he could only describe as gratitude, a look that said she understood that he had saved her family. Outside, the storm raged on with a fury that seemed almost personal. Jake could hear trees cracking and falling under the weight of ice and snow. The wind howled like a living thing and the temperature continued to drop. He knew that without the shelter, none of them would have survived the night. As the cubs nursed and played, Jake found himself studying their mother more closely. She was a magnificent animal, larger and more powerful than any wolf he had studied in his research. Her coat was a beautiful mixture of gray, black, and silver, and her eyes held an intelligence that was almost unsettling. This was clearly the alpha female of her pack, a leader who had made the desperate decision to trust a human when all other options were exhausted. Jake began to wonder about the rest of her pack. Where was the alpha male? Were there other wolves who had been caught in the storm? The mother's willingness to approach a human suggested that her situation had been truly desperate, that she had exhausted all other possibilities before taking such a dangerous risk. As the night wore on, Jake found himself dozing fitfully, lulled by the warmth of the shelter and the soft sounds of the cubs playing with their mother. But he never slept deeply, maintaining the alertness that had kept him alive in the wilderness for so many years. The mother wolf seemed to understand that they were partners in survival now. Several times during the night, when the cubs became restless or when the storm seemed to intensify, she would look at Jake as if seeking reassurance, and each time Jake would speak softly to her, maintaining the fragile trust that had formed between them. Dawn came slowly, filtered through the walls of their tiny shelter and the continuing snowfall outside. Jake had barely slept, but he felt oddly refreshed. The storm had finally begun to weaken, though snow was still falling steadily. More importantly, all three cubs were not only alive but showing real signs of recovery. The smallest cub, the little female with white markings, had become surprisingly bold during the night. She had gradually worked her way closer to Jake, drawn by curiosity that seemed to overcome her natural fear of humans. At one point, she had actually sniffed his gloved hand, her tiny wet nose cold against the fabric. The mother wolf had watched this interaction carefully, but she hadn't intervened. In fact, Jake thought he detected something like approval in her yellow eyes. It was as if she understood that Jake had proven himself trustworthy, and she was allowing her cubs to learn that not all humans were dangerous. As the light outside grew stronger, Jake knew they couldn't stay in the shelter much longer. His emergency supplies were running low, and the cubs needed food that only their mother could provide through nursing, which required her to eat soon. The mother wolf also seemed restless, occasionally lifting her head to listen to sounds from outside that Jake couldn't hear. Jake carefully unzipped the tent flap and looked outside. The world had been completely transformed by the blizzard. Snow had drifted as high as 15 feet in some places, and his snowmobile was completely buried. Trees that had stood for decades were down, their massive trunks snapped like twigs by the force of the wind and ice. But the immediate area around their shelter had been partially protected by the natural windbreak, and Jake could see a possible path through the downed trees toward higher ground. If they could reach the ridgeline about half a mile away, they might be able to find a more permanent shelter and figure out their next move. The challenge was moving 3 young cubs through deep snow and debris from the storm. The cubs were stronger than they had been the night before, but they were still too young and small to travel far on their own. The mother wolf seemed to understand this problem too, and Jake could see her looking back and forth between her cubs and the difficult terrain outside. That's when Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. He had a large backpack designed for carrying research equipment, and he realized it might be just big enough to carry the cubs while their mother led the way through the snow. It was a crazy idea, hiking through a post-blizzard wilderness while carrying a pack full of wolf cubs, but it might be their only chance. Jake carefully removed his research equipment from the backpack and showed the empty pack to the mother wolf. At first she was suspicious, sniffing the strange object and backing away slightly. But when Jake gently placed one of the cubs near the opening of the pack, she seemed to understand what he was proposing. The mother wolf looked at Jake for a long moment, and he felt like she was weighing her options one final time. Then, incredibly, she began helping him place her cubs in the backpack. She would gently pick up each cub and position it carefully in the pack, making sure they were comfortable and secure. The cubs, for their part, seemed to find the whole experience rather amusing. They were warm and safe, and being carried in the pack probably felt similar to being carried in their mother's mouth, which was how wolf mothers normally transported young cubs. With the cubs secured in his backpack, Jake began the difficult journey through the snow-covered debris field. The mother wolf took the lead, using her superior senses and knowledge of the terrain to find the safest path. Jake followed, struggling through snow that sometimes came up to his waist, his precious cargo making soft whimpering sounds behind his head. The journey to the ridge was exhausting. Jake had to climb over fallen trees, navigate around massive snowdrifts, and constantly watch his footing on the treacherous terrain. Several times he slipped and nearly fell, and each time the mother wolf would stop and wait, making sure he and her cubs were safe before continuing. About halfway to the ridge, they encountered something that stopped them all in their tracks. Fresh tracks in the snow, large paw prints that could only belong to other wolves. The mother wolf's entire demeanor changed instantly. Her ears perked up, her tail stiffened, and she let out a series of soft barks that Jake had never heard before. From somewhere ahead of them, an answering howl echoed across the snow-covered landscape. The mother wolf's response was immediate and joyful. She threw back her head and howled with such emotion that Jake felt tears forming in his eyes. This wasn't just communication. This was a reunion. Within minutes, 3 other wolves appeared through the trees ahead of them. Jake's first instinct was fear. He was now facing 4 adult wolves with their cubs on his back. But the mother wolf's behavior reassured him. She was wagging her tail and whimpering with joy, the universal language of happiness that was the same whether you were a wolf or a domestic dog. The largest of the approaching wolves was clearly the alpha male, the father of the cubs Jake was carrying. He was massive, even larger than the mother, with a thick coat of dark gray fur and intelligent amber eyes. Behind him were 2 other wolves, probably other members of their pack who had been searching for the missing family. The reunion was extraordinary to witness. The pack surrounded the mother wolf, touching noses and whimpering with what was clearly relief and joy. The alpha male was particularly gentle with his mate, nuzzling her and checking her for injuries with careful precision. But then all 4 adult wolves turned their attention to Jake, and for a moment, his heart stopped. He was facing a full wolf pack and he had their cubs strapped to his back. Every survival instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go, and running would only trigger their chase instincts. The mother wolf, however, did something that saved Jake's life. She positioned herself between him and the other wolves and began what could only be described as explaining the situation. She barked and whined, gestured with her head toward Jake and the cubs, and even demonstrated by gently touching Jake's arm with her nose. Jake could hardly believe what he was witnessing. This wild animal was actually vouching for him to her pack, explaining that he was a friend who had helped save her cubs. It was interspecies communication at a level that most scientists said was impossible. The alpha male approached Jake slowly, his massive head lowered and his amber eyes fixed on the human who had somehow become part of his family's survival story. Jake stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as the enormous wolf came within arm's length. The cubs in his backpack had gone quiet, sensing the tension in the air. For what felt like an eternity, the alpha male studied Jake with an intensity that seemed to look straight into his soul. Jake could smell the wild scent of the wolf, feel the power radiating from its muscular frame, and see the intelligence that burned in those ancient amber eyes. This was a predator capable of killing a full-grown moose, and Jake was completely at its mercy. Then something remarkable happened. The alpha male sniffed Jake carefully, much the same way the mother wolf had done when they first met. But instead of backing away or showing aggression, the great wolf did something that would haunt Jake for the rest of his life. He gently licked Jake's gloved hand, a gesture of acceptance and gratitude that transcended every boundary between human and wild animal. The other pack members seemed to take this as a signal that Jake was to be trusted. They relaxed their aggressive postures and began showing curiosity instead of hostility. One of them, a beautiful silver-gray female, even approached close enough to sniff the backpack containing the cubs, her tail wagging slightly when she heard their soft whimpering sounds. The mother wolf began the process of retrieving her cubs from Jake's backpack, but she did it with the same careful cooperation they had developed during their night together. She would gently extract one cub at a time, allowing Jake to help support each small body as she pulled it free. The cubs seemed perfectly content with this arrangement, treating the whole experience as an interesting adventure. As each cub was reunited with the pack, Jake witnessed scenes of pure animal emotion that challenged everything he thought he knew about wildlife behavior. The alpha male was incredibly gentle with his offspring, nuzzling each one carefully and checking them for injuries with the thoroughness of a worried father. The other pack members surrounded the cubs with protective attention, creating a circle of warmth and security that no storm could penetrate. But Jake knew that his role in this incredible story was far from over. The pack was reunited, but they were still stranded in the aftermath of a devastating blizzard. The cubs were too young to travel far, and the pack needed to find food and permanent shelter. The natural den where the cubs had been born was completely destroyed, buried under tons of snow and debris. The alpha male seemed to be thinking the same thing. After ensuring his cubs were safe and healthy, he turned his attention back to Jake with a look that was unmistakably thoughtful. Jake had the strange sensation that the wolf was trying to figure out how to repay the debt he owed to this human who had saved his family. The answer came when the pack began to move toward the ridgeline Jake had been trying to reach. The alpha male took the lead, but instead of setting a pace that would leave Jake behind, he adjusted his speed to match the human's slower progress through the snow. The message was clear. Jake was now part of their group, at least temporarily, and they weren't going to abandon him any more than he had abandoned them. The journey to the ridge revealed the full scope of the destruction caused by the blizzard. Entire sections of forest had been flattened, and landmarks that Jake had known for years were completely gone. Without the wolves' superior knowledge of the terrain, he would have been hopelessly lost in this transformed landscape. When they finally reached the ridgeline, Jake understood why the wolves had been heading in this direction. There, partially sheltered by a rock outcropping and protected from the worst of the wind, was a natural cave system that could provide secure shelter for the pack. It was the kind of place that took generations of wolf knowledge to find, and Jake realized he was being given access to secrets that few humans had ever witnessed. The pack immediately began investigating the caves, checking for other animals that might have taken shelter there and ensuring the area was safe for the cubs. Jake watched in fascination as they worked together with the coordinated efficiency of a military unit, each wolf knowing exactly what their role was in the process. The mother wolf, meanwhile, stayed close to Jake, continuing to serve as his protector and guide within the pack dynamic. Whenever one of the other wolves seemed uncertain about his presence, she would position herself between them and communicate in ways that Jake was beginning to recognize as reassurance and explanation. As the day progressed, Jake began to understand that he was witnessing something unprecedented in the relationship between humans and wild wolves. These animals had not only accepted him as a temporary pack member, but they were actively working to ensure his survival, just as he had worked to ensure theirs. The alpha male demonstrated this most clearly when he led Jake to a small stream that was still flowing despite the freezing temperatures. The wolf showed him where the water was safe to drink, and even waited while Jake filled his water bottle, as if understanding that humans had different ways of consuming water than wolves did. Later, when Jake began showing signs of exhaustion from the difficult journey, the pack actually adjusted their activities to accommodate his need for rest. They settled in the protected area near the caves and allowed him to recover his strength, while they kept watch for any potential threats. As evening approached, Jake faced a decision that would define the rest of his life. His snowmobile was buried and probably irreparable, his radio wasn't working, and he was miles from any human contact. He could try to hike out on his own, but in his weakened condition and without proper equipment, it would be extremely dangerous. The wolves, however, were offering him something unprecedented, the chance to stay with them until conditions improved, to be protected and guided by animals that now considered him part of their family. It was an opportunity that no wildlife researcher had ever experienced, but it also meant trusting his life completely to predators that most humans feared and misunderstood. Jake made the decision to stay with the wolf pack, and that choice led to 3 weeks of experiences that would forever change his understanding of wildlife and the bonds that could exist between humans and animals. The pack treated him as a respected member of their group, protecting him from dangers he couldn't even perceive and sharing their knowledge of survival in ways that no textbook could ever teach. During those weeks, Jake learned to read the subtle communications between pack members, understanding when they had detected threats or found food sources. The alpha male taught him to recognize safe ice on frozen streams and showed him which plants could provide emergency nutrition. The mother wolf, who Jake began thinking of as Luna because of her silvery markings, continued to serve as his primary protector and translator within the pack's complex social structure. The cubs, meanwhile, grew stronger and more adventurous every day. The little female with white markings, whom Jake privately named Star, became particularly attached to him. She would often sleep curled up against his sleeping bag at night, and during the day she would follow him around the cave system with the fearless curiosity of a young animal who had never learned to fear humans. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Jake's time with the pack was witnessing their hunting strategies and family dynamics. The wolves worked together with a coordination and intelligence that amazed him. They had complex systems for communicating during hunts, elaborate social hierarchies that maintained order without violence, and child-rearing practices that ensured every cub received the attention and protection they needed. Jake also discovered that his presence had changed the pack in subtle but important ways. His different perspective and problem-solving abilities occasionally provided solutions that the wolves might not have considered. When a rockfall blocked their access to one of their favorite hunting grounds, Jake was able to suggest an alternative route that the wolves then improved upon with their superior knowledge of the terrain. The turning point came when a helicopter finally appeared in the skies above their valley. Jake's disappearance had triggered a massive search and rescue operation, and after weeks of searching, they had finally located the area where his snowmobile had been buried. Jake could have easily signaled the helicopter and been rescued immediately, but he found himself hesitating. The wolves had detected the aircraft long before Jake heard it, and their reaction was immediate and instinctive. They began moving toward the deeper caves, preparing to hide from what they perceived as a potential threat. But Luna, the mother wolf who had started this entire adventure, did something that demonstrated the depth of the bond that had formed between them. She approached Jake and looked directly into his eyes, and in that moment Jake understood that she was giving him a choice. She knew what the helicopter meant, knew that it represented his return to the human world, and she was telling him that he was free to go. But she was also making it clear that if he chose to stay, the pack would continue to protect and care for him. Jake realized that he was being offered something that might never be available to another human being, the chance to truly become part of a wild wolf pack, to live as they lived and see the world through their eyes. It was a tempting offer, but Jake also understood his responsibilities to the human world and to the scientific community that could benefit from what he had learned. He made his decision with heavy heart but clear conscience. Using his emergency mirror, Jake signaled the helicopter and began the process of returning to civilization. But before the rescue team could reach him, he had one final interaction with the pack that would stay with him forever. The alpha male approached him one last time, and the great wolf did something that Jake had never seen in any wildlife documentation. The wolf actually bowed his massive head in what could only be interpreted as a gesture of respect and gratitude. One by one, the other pack members approached and touched their noses to Jake's hands, a formal farewell that seemed to acknowledge him as a permanent member of their extended family. Luna was the last to say goodbye, and her farewell was the most emotional. She nuzzled his face gently, whimpering softly in a way that sounded heartbreakingly like crying. The little cubs, not understanding what was happening, tried to follow Jake as he began walking toward the approaching rescue team, and had to be gently restrained by their parents. The rescue itself was dramatic enough to make headlines around the world. Jake had survived 3 weeks in the wilderness during one of the worst winters on record, and his story of being rescued by wolves challenged every assumption about human-animal relationships. But Jake knew that the real story was much more complex and meaningful than anything the media could capture. In the months that followed, Jake returned to the area several times, always hoping to catch a glimpse of the pack that had saved his life. On a few occasions, he found tracks and signs that suggested they were still in the area, thriving and raising their cubs in the way that wolves had done for thousands of years. But he never saw them again, and Jake came to understand that this was probably how it should be. The experience had changed him profoundly, giving him insights into animal intelligence and emotion that would influence his research for the rest of his career. He became a passionate advocate for wolf conservation, using his unique experience to educate others about the complex social lives and remarkable intelligence of these misunderstood predators. The story of Jake and the wolf pack became a powerful reminder that the boundaries between species are not as rigid as humans often believe. In moments of crisis when survival is at stake, the bonds of compassion and mutual aid can transcend every difference between human and animal. Jake never forgot the lesson that Luna had taught him during that desperate night in the blizzard, that sometimes the greatest courage comes from asking for help, and that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can save lives. The memory of those amber eyes looking at him with trust and gratitude would haunt him in the best possible way for the rest of his life. A constant reminder of the magic that exists in the wild places of the world, and the extraordinary creatures that call them home.